This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
So the first panel continues thinking about orientation, but particularly in reference to gender and sexuality. The first speaker on this panel is Emily Rose, who is in the first year, as she's already explained, in the first year of her PhD at the University of East Anglia. And Emily's PhD thesis is called, at the moment, The Translation of Trans Identity to Transgress Norms or Normalise Transgressions. And the title of Emily's paper, as you can see, is Passing Up the Gender Masquerade, Queering the Translation of a Transgender Memoir.
Thank you. So, those who perhaps experience the most limitations on their capacity to openly be themselves in society are trans people. For this paper, I am using trans as an umbrella term to include a wide variety of identities, while I use transgender to refer to a specific identity defined by the Oxford English Dictionary as a person whose identity does not conform unambiguously to conventions of male or female gender, but combines or moves between these. There's often an element of passing involved in the life of a trans person, whether that's successfully passing as a different gender and thus hiding their status as trans, or failing to pass and suffering the consequences. An art form that also passes is translation, especially in Anglophone countries where translations tend to have more success if they pass as original works. However, intentionally failing to pass, both in terms of identity and translation, can be subversive and thought-provoking. In this paper, I'll give a brief description of the Chevalier d'Eon, author of the Transgender Memoir of my title, seen here on the right, giving a fencing demonstration as a woman. I'll consider how both people who perform gender and translations pass, and I'll be asking what a translator can do for trans identity if the translator is considered a powerful and creative agent of change. Only in 2012, Edgar Carrett said that translators are like ninjas. If you see them, they're no good. Translators are still often considered best if they're invisible. I'll then look at the translation of the Chevalier d'Eon's memoir into English, and finally I'll suggest new, powerful and queer ways that transgender memoirs could be translated in order to pass up to gender, but also the translation masquerade. Charles Geneviève Louis Auguste André Timothée d'Eon de Beaumont, d'Eon for short, author of the great historical epistle of the Chevalier d'Eon from 1785, was born on October 5th, 1728 in Tonnerre. At birth he was assigned the male sex, but in 1771, while he was in London, ostensibly in the diplomatic service, but also spying on the English for the French king, a rumour began to spread that he was really a woman. He did nothing to quash these rumours, and could possibly have been their source. When d'Eon decided to return to France from England, one of the conditions of his return was that he dress as a woman. He claims in the memoir that he was born a girl, but brought up as a boy because his parents wanted a male heir. However, when d'Eon died in 1810, everyone, including his housemate of 15 years, was surprised to discover that the Chevalier had a male body. What we have then is the fictional story of a woman who dresses as a man, then returns to her natural state of womanhood, told by a man who lives the first half of his life as a man and the second half as a woman, and claiming to really be a woman. As you can see in this example here, which comes from the first page of the Great Epistle, in his memoir, d'Eon unconventionally uses both masculine and feminine gender markers, sometimes in the same sentence, and he is often considered one of the most famous transvestites in history. Transsexuals and transvestites, or crossdressers, often attempt to pass as their preferred gender in heteronormative surroundings, and translations often attempt to pass as original writing in literary surroundings. Passing a translation off as an original work encourages the invisibility of the translator and the superiority of the original text. For centuries, translation has been considered using sartorial metaphors. So, the metaphor of translation as the redressing of a body of meaning in the clothes of another language. A cross-dresser covers and conceals their physical body with clothing, and according to this metaphor, a translation covers and conceals the original textual body with a new text. Translation was also often compared to the idea of clothing the source author. In 1790, Alexander Fraser Tytler wrote that a translator must be ever so thoroughly master of the sense of his author, because if the translator is not, he will present him through a distorted medium, or exhibit him often in a garb that is unsuitable to his character. Can we compare a cross-dresser who fails to pass by choosing the wrong clothes for their performance to a translator who fails to produce a good translation by choosing the wrong clothes for their author? The body clothes metaphor is rooted in a Socratic quest for the truth as something which is always concealed under layers of representation. The goal of proponents of this metaphor is to produce a textual attire that will most fully allow the original body to shine through. The translator must be invisible, letting the text seem as if it portrays the essential core that the author created. The translator is a traitor if he or she attempts to replace the author's voice with his or her own. In 1683, Petrus Danielus Quetus was of the opinion that a translation that departs from the original is a deception. He asks, who would not burn with anger when he feels that his face has been ill-represented? An adulterated translation is most like a woman's face plastered with cosmetics. Both bad translation, so translation that deviates from the original, and transvestism have been viewed as the act of changing an external appearance to misrepresent an internal truth. However, that translation is always a betrayal of the original text or author, which the Italian aphorism translator would suggest it always is, shows it cannot possibly hope to uncover and represent the original text's true internal meaning. Something always has to be left out. When the body clothes metaphor is subjected to thought from transgender and queer studies, interesting conclusions can be drawn. According to John Dryden in 1680, the ultimate duty of the translator as tailor is to vary but the dress, not to alter or destroy the substance. But is there any definitive substance to be destroyed? The idea of the original authoritative text and author has been challenged by translation theorists. And transgender and queer theories show there's no single body underneath, no true essence really exists, no matter how many layers of clothing one peels aside. In translation, there's no ultimate meaning to be uncovered and then recovered in a new language. All translation is an interpretation of an original text that is itself an interpretation of words already used. The inevitability of betrayal in translation is not a negative thing. As Maria Tomoshko and Evelyn Gensler say, it is also an aspect that makes the act of translation partisan, engaged and committed either implicitly or explicitly. A translation that fails to pass, so that it is clearly a translation, is no longer a believable linguistic reproduction, but is problematic, unfaithful and yet creative. A person who successfully passes is believable and unproblematic. When the passing itself fails and the deception is revealed, the body becomes unbelievable and problematic. The person reading the performance has their trust that everyone is who they appear to be betrayed. But this revelation doesn't have to be negative either. Gender identities such as the cross-dressed man or woman who don't conform to norms actually expose the performativity of all gender. According to Judith Butler, drag is not an aberration from the norm. It shows how the norm actually functions, how the norm is instituted through our bodies. In attempting to pass as male or female, and in having to learn how to be a man or a woman, the transsexual or cross-dresser shows how we all pass. Gender stereotypes are not inherent, but learned. None of us has a gender core. However, according to Sarah Chin, cross-dressing denaturalizes gender only if it is self-conscious, and its agenda, or the agenda of its audience, is anti-essentialist. I believe that Chin's point falls down when we consider the power of writing to expose what was once hidden. The Chevalier d'Eon doesn't cross-dress for anti-essentialist ends, but he can still inadvertently expose gender as a masquerade through his writing. In writing, any performance becomes explicit to the reader. In his memoir, d'Eon dissociates females from femininity because he's biologically male. He exposes Butler's idea that gender is performative, made up of a repeated performance that we cannot change whenever we want to, but which we can play with. Individuals absorb cultural norms that influence their behaviour, and they either adhere to them or reject them. The debate between the supposed conventionality of transsexual persons or cross-dressers who pass, and the supposed transgression of transgender persons who want to remain ambiguous and therefore don't attempt to pass, has led to another debate over how trans people should wish to be seen. Butler advocates legitimising complexity, so that what is considered human is expanded to include trans people, while J. Jack Halberstam claims that trans people should remain and celebrate being non-human. I believe the question of whether trans identity should be legitimised or purposely marginalised is a debate that could benefit from an exploration of how trans identities are translated when translation can legitimise or marginalise depending on how it is performed. Although it is highly anachronistic to put modern labels on people who couldn't have chosen such labels for themselves, I don't believe that Dayan was a crossdresser, and neither do his translators. I should also mention that because I'm arguing that Dayan is transgender, using the pronoun he to refer to him is quite problematic. Usually when talking about transgender people, you would ask them which pronoun they prefer. I can't do that with Dayan, which is a shame. And in my writing, I try to use he/she or she, which is, it's quite difficult for an oral presentation. So I'm using he, which is actually how most theorists refer to him. Roland Champagne, Nina Eckstein, and Gary Cates, who are Dayan's translators, describe his memoir as certainly the story of a transgender person, but it narrates the journey of a supposed male-to-female transvestite, when the actual situation involved a male-to-female transgendered life. In order to overcome the challenge of representing grammatical gender in English, Dayan's translators decided to indicate the way that Dayan marked his own gender with an M or an F. So here, Dayan is talking to the late king's daughter about his role as a spy during the king's lifetime. He uses the feminine gender throughout, except for devenu, which is masculine. That Dayan uses the masculine gender on a verb like become, a trans verb of transition, hints to ambiguity because it suggests that before this becoming he was female, but he does not fully become male because the gender on servant remains feminine. He has become both masculine and feminine. Champagne, Eckstein and Cates deviate from translation norms with their M and F in superscript, but this doesn't make the reader question other norms, such as the gender binary. Is their strategy too safe? If I'm arguing that Dayan is what we would now call transgender, should I be looking for translation strategies that promote ambiguity? If the translator wished to be more radical and wished to reflect not just the language of the original, but also wished to promote ambiguous transgender narratives, a more interventionist experimental strategy could be used. The translator can only play with discourses available, but how far can this play go? Is there a way of moving beyond the debate between marginalising and legitimising to show that Dayan is a human, normative subject who also manages to contest normativity by critiquing gender and embodiment? Could we see transgender identity as formed from layers of bodies, in the same way that translation is often considered to be intertextual and therefore constituted from layers of text? Jean Bobby Noble sees trans bodies as grafted, where one materialisation is haunted by the other, as opposed to crossing or exiting. Moving away from the notion of passing is important. According to Kate Bornstein, through the mandate of passing, the culture uses transsexuals to reinforce the bipolar gender system as transsexuals strive for recognition within their new gender. She also claims that passing becomes invisibility, lies, and self-denial. Sandy Stone considers the merits of moving beyond the concept of passing as a way of creating discourse that speaks for trans lives. She asks transsexuals to become post-transsexual, to be consciously read, to read oneself aloud, and by this troubling and productive reading, to begin to write oneself into the discourses by which one has been written. When a translator passes as an author, they become invisible. They deny themselves and their creative ability. Could a translator become a post-translator by writing themselves into their text and into textual discourse, by allowing their status as translator to be consciously read? Something that suggests the idea of the grafting of new texts and bodies onto old, the idea of representing two conflicting ideas at once, and allows the translator to be read, is the palimpsest. In the general sense of the term, the texts of a palimpsest are not necessarily connected. In the past, texts were erased from parchment or papyrus to make room for new texts. Those erasures being incomplete, the old text would show through. The old text could be mathematical and the new religious. As we have here, this image is from a very famous palimpsest called the Archimedes palimpsest. So the bottom layer of text, which is in red, was written by Archimedes in the 10th century, so that's our mathematical text. But it was erased and then written over in the 13th century, in black, by Christian monks. But the erasure didn't entirely work, and we can now see both texts. We can use an analogy of the palimpsest to dispel notions of the originality of all writing, because as Georges Eekhoud says, there is no literary work that does not evoke, to some extent, and according to how it is read, some other literary work. Furthermore, the texts of the palimpsest are not ordered in a hierarchy. They are not separate from each other, and they are not the essential attributes of the palimpsest. If this is the case, could the palimpsest help dispel notions of the essentiality of gender? According to Sarah Dillon, the palimpsest serves as the hymen that holds the masculine phenotext and the feminine genotext together and apart, the phenotext being the text of the surface, and the genotext being what is underneath. So, with this example, the phenotext is the Christian text on top, and the genotext is Archimedes' text underneath. In our analogy, the masculine phenotext would be the text that we see on the page, while the feminine genotext would be the text influences, so for example what the author or the translator has read before. This holding together and apart by a membrane eliminates the space between the two texts, which at the same time preserves their separate identities and inscribes difference within the heart of the identity of the palimpsest. The vellum of the palimpsest thus represents the inter, the between of the texts, a between that is no longer that of difference, but of identity, an identity redefined as and traversed by difference. Perhaps trans experience could be the between of bodies, a between that is characterised by queer notions of identity as unstable. According to Dillon, the palimpsest has a role in the queering of textuality, writing, reading, and identity, because it is a figure for the post-structuralist notion of the spectralised subject. Queer and the palimpsest can be understood as structurally comparable figures for the essential involutedness of identity, be it sexual, gender, or racial. In order to pass up the gender masquerade, perhaps any translation of a transgender text should be queer. Should literally show its divisions, its multiplicities, in order to point to the multiplicity of the character it reproduces. McGinnity describes translation as never having one single identity, but always a lack and a supplement, and it can never be a transparent representation. Only an interpretative transformation that exposes multiple and divided meanings in the foreign text, and displaces it with another set of meanings, equally multiple and divided. In querying their translation, the translator can interrogate and denaturalize any text, exposing its internal contradictions. The queer destabilization of translation could be done through paratexts, through the use of introductions, footnotes, or annotations pointing to the translation's influences. Lawrence Venuti considers that translators need to stop short of making their text parodic or incomprehensible if they are to have any success at all. However, if one dares to truly be a post-translator, to move away from the idea of the translator as a faithful servant, perhaps one should risk going beyond the comprehensible and beyond the acceptable. We can expose all gender as a complex masquerade, and yet at the same time show that transgender people, like Dale, are human through the palimpsestuous translation of transgender identities. If we create a true palimpsest of translation over source text, then we are creating something recognisable and yet incomprehensible, normative and yet non-normative, multiple and yet unified, masculine and yet feminine, foreign and yet domestic. If we are prepared to overcome differences between languages through experiment and risk, we can pass up the gender and translation masquerade and expose all writing and all gender as always already queer.
much, Emily. Okay, so the next paper, if it's all right with everyone, we will save questions until the presenters have given their papers, but hopefully there'll be plenty of time for that at the end. Our next speaker is Orla McGinnity. Sorry, Orla. So she's also in the first year of her PhD, and she's working at Trinity College, Dublin. And her PhD thesis is pithily called Mallarmé and the Political. And her paper today is entitled Reflections of Gender in the Space of Mallarmé, Reorientating the Question of Representation.
So, the relatively small body of work published and written by Stéphane Mallarmé has had a disproportional impact on 20th century thought, with his work providing a strong influence on as diverse and divergent a range of prominent thinkers as Alain Badiou, Jacques Rancière, Jacques Derrida, Julia Kristeva, and Maurice Blanchot. His position as a key literary precursor to the movement of deconstruction was cemented by Derrida's reading of his short text Mimique in 1970's La Double Séance, where the undecidable movement of Mallarmé's syntax is demonstrated to accomplish a displacement and reorientation of the traditional Western metaphysical determination of mimesis. The question that will interest me today is that of the relation between mimesis and gender in the work of Mallarmé, and how gender may prove an obstacle to the seemingly seamless perversion of the Platonic understanding of mimesis as dangerous supplement that is enacted by Mallarmé's work. His re-inscription of our concepts of writing and representation was undoubtedly an inspiration and a catalyst for the strains and trains of thought that ultimately, indirectly, engendered what we now know as gender theory. However, the rerouting of the relationship between word and referent accomplished by his poetics is not necessarily devoid of traces of essentialist ontology. It may thus prove fruitful or even necessary to revisit his corpus in order to explore the presence or absence of a concept of gender operating in his thought, and to reflect on the implications of such a notion. Crucial for such a critical enterprise are the insights and intuitions of deconstructive thinker Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe, who, in the wake of Derrida's reading of Mimique, exhumed the question of mimesis in Mallarmé's work in his 1991 text, Musica Ficta. While acknowledging the subversive value of Mallarmé's approach to mimesis, Lacoue-Labarthe suspects and detects a hampering of the radicality of this thought by the anchoring of his literary enterprise in its teleological orientation towards what Lacoue-Labarthe refers to as ontotypology. Lacoue-Labarthe insists, à se rendre attentif au discours politique de Mallarmé, une interrogation ne peut manquer de se former. Pourquoi cet étrange arrêt, répété, constant, presque obstiné, sur le culte, la communion, le type et le mythe? Pourquoi, sur ce point, l'esquisse assurément elliptique, mais tout de même systématique, d'une théorie politique et philosophique du grand art qui sous-tend, comme dans tous les renversements modernes du platonisme, issus en réalité du romantisme, une ontotypologie déclarée. The type to which Mallarmé continually refers in his work thus casts aspersions on the validity of his purported untimely deconstruction of mimesis, hinting at an end goal that is ontologically oriented. The term ontotypology was forged by Lacoue-Labarthe in his 1975 essay Typographie on the model of the Heideggerian philosophy of ontothéology, and it designates l'ontologie qui sous-tend à la fois la pensée la plus ancienne de la mimesis et la moderne pensée par figure gestalt qui en procède. The modern device of the gestalt or figure, then, is the latest in a series of ontological configurations derived from a metaphysics of presence or pure essential being. Mallarmé's poetics is read as aiming to remove itself from all external material elements that detract or distract from its essence, with its ultimate task being to render the human mystery of language present to itself, a metaphysical mission construed by Lacoue-Labarthe as ontotypological. In her 1990 essay, Imitation and Gender Insubordination, Butler explicitly draws on Derrida's reading of Mallarméan mimetology in La Double Séance, in order to illustrate how gender arises in a mimetic economy, where it regularly produces its own ideal or originary essence through imitation. Although the terms of her insightful discussion are explicitly acknowledged as referring to the thought of Mallarmé, the question of how gender figured in Mallarmé's own thought and its orientation in relation to the key interpretive concepts of mimesis and ontotypology remains to be addressed. To begin to explore whether Mallarmé upholds or subverts traditional or autotypological notions of understandings of gendered modes of orientation in his work, we will initially and primarily approach his writing in the fashion journal La Dernière Mode. The short-lived periodical that Mallarmé actually wrote himself for several months in 1874 is a fertile and complex textual terrain for exploration. We will consider the significance of Mallarmé's assumption of female writing identities and subject matter in order to nuance and question the constructions and deconstructions of gender at work in his writing. So in order to authoritatively deal with the topic of fashion, Mallarmé adopts first one and then multiple female pen names. So here you have a list. On the top are the female names and on the bottom are the male pseudonyms. I won't read them out because of time, but you can see there's a lot. Initially using just the identity of Marguerite de Ponty to write the aspect of the journal dealing specifically with fashion, Mallarmé gradually expands his repertoire of signatures to include a host of women with the appropriate cultural or gender authority to authorize their advice on fashion and topics of maternal or generally female interest. So how are we to understand this authorial performance? Could this play of differences be seen as a subversive strategy of parody on Mallarmé's part, a performative endeavour intended to undermine the boundaries of what Butler has referred to as the categorical fiction of gender? In this case, the journal could be read as a systematic dismantling of the myth of woman, and a delightful case of literary drag, where the proto-deconstructionist poet immerses himself in the material economy of femininity in order to provide us with what has actually been referred to as a nearly postmodern exercise. The reorientation of the usual direction of gender crossing in pseudonyms provides in this sense a charming detail, further enabling and authorizing us to read with glee the ironic passages and applaud Mallarmé's forward-thinking open-mindedness and sensitivity to the complexities of the issue of gender. His literary gender performance, thus understood, would indeed neatly tie in with the reading of gender Mimique indirectly inspires in Butler, who remarks that, here I'm also quoting something similar to Emily, drag is not the putting on of a gender that belongs properly to some other group, i.e. an act of expropriation or appropriation that assumes that gender is the rightful property of sex, that masculine belongs to male and feminine belongs to female. There is no proper gender, a gender proper to one sex rather than another, which is in some sense that sex's cultural property. There is no original or primary gender that drag imitates, but gender is a kind of imitation for which there is no original. In fact, it is a kind of imitation that produces the very notion of the original as an effect and consequence of the imitation itself. From Butler's perspective, we could re-envisage Mallarmé's drag as repeating the mimetic structure of gender itself, thus constituting a performative enactment, a performative acknowledgement of the lack of unified gender essence at the source of writing, a parodic enactment of what Lacoulabarthe has described as a mimesis sans modèle, a mimesis without a model. However, the legitimacy of reading Mallarmé's journalistic outing as a host of female writers in La Dernière Mode as a performative subversion of the fiction of gender is problematized in the understanding of gender differences that appears to emerge in both the journal itself and indeed in comments made elsewhere by Mallarmé. A sense of the existence of a native creative origin that is proper to the male poetic subject and travestied when contaminated with the dynamic of imitation reigning in the female economy of signification is betrayed if we compare comments on the decorative features of jewellery in La Dernière Mode on the one hand and the virtues of the virtual jewels of masculine poetic creation espoused by Mallarmé in an 1891 interview on the other. Though speaking of jewels, Mallarmé, writing as Marguerite de Ponty, remarks Fleurs et joyaux, chaque espèce n'a-t-elle pas, comme qui dirait, son sol? Tel éclat de soleil convient-t-elle à cette fleur? Tel type de femme à ces joyaux? Cette harmonie naturelle régna dans le passé, mais elle semble abolie dans le présent. La civilisation visait l'époque où a disparu presque toute puissance créatrice, dans la bijouterie comme dans le mobilier. Et dans l'un comme dans l'autre, nous sommes forcés ou d'exhumer ou d'importer. This disruption of natural harmony referred to elsewhere by Mallarmé as a double courant archaïque et exotique, with the contingent imperative to imitate the past or the foreign, is not attended in La Dernière Mode by any particular denigration of the imitative functioning of the economy of fashion. However, in a later personal interview, when jewels come to metaphorically signify the words of poets, a stringent necessity for authenticity is established, and the imperative to create is framed in terms of a gender dichotomy. La poésie consistant à créer, il faut prendre dans l'âme humaine des états, des lueurs d'une pureté si absolue que, bien chanté et bien mis en lumière, cela constitue en effet le joyau de l'homme. Là, il y a symbole, il y a création, et le mot poésie a ici son sens. C'est, en somme, la seule création humaine possible. Et si, véritablement, des pierres précieuses dont on se part ne manifestent pas un état d'âme, c'est indûment qu'on s'en part. La femme, par exemple, cette éternelle voleuse. So women's status in relation to the poetic language that crystallizes ordinary language into the precious gems of mankind, of poetry of mankind, is that of a thief. The only human creation possible, then, is inaccessible and unattainable to her. A fact that has been acknowledged by Lucien. Oh. Sorry. Okay, these are in the wrong order. Lucien Frappier et Mazur, who has noted in relation to La Dernière Mode that le féminin recule au moment même où s'esquisse la possibilité d'une création véritable. In light of this elucidation of woman's essential incapacity for authentic poetic language, the enthusiastic declaration in La Dernière Mode that women are particularly well placed in modern times to engage as readers seems disingenuous in a way that is far removed from playful irony. So, quoting from La Dernière Mode, seule une dame, dans son isolement de la politique et des soins moroses, a le loisir nécessaire pour que s'en dégage, sa toilette achevée, un besoin de se parer aussi l'âme. Apparently, the abundance of free time that especially qualifies the female mind to be ornamented with the jewels of poets is not quite sufficient to authorize her to interact in a role other than that of thief, adorning herself with the treasures of men, inherently incapable of reaching the mystical state of mind necessary for the formation and evocation of the absolutely pure gleaming jewels. So the seed planted in the thought of Mallarmé for a reconfiguration and reorientation of our thought on gender seems to have taken much longer than the lifetime of the poet himself to germinate and ultimately flower into the contemporary understanding of gender as a mimésis sans modèle, or in the terms of Butler, performative construction of subjectivity. A curious intersection between mimesis and gender is at play in the work of Mallarmé, an intersection that this paper by no means claims to definitively explain or resolve, whereby Mallarmé's transgression of his own masculine authority and his curious foray into the realm of female fashion journalism, which is an undoubtedly unique and fascinating, if not quite postmodern experiment, seems nonetheless accompanied by an excessively negative understanding of the female subject in relation to the ontotypologically determined male creative spirit. Without entirely neatly mapping onto typical misogynist paradigms of femininity, there is undoubtedly a gendered distinction at the core of his thought. It gives us pause before we once again proclaim him the ultimate perverter of Western metaphysical structures of representation, as inaugurated by Plato and deconstructed by Derrida. It is curious that while the origin of true poetic creativity appears to be proper to the male subject, the female Mallarmé more appropriately seems to figure the subversive type of mimesis we usually associate with being valorized in the work of Mallarmé. This gendering of mimesis and its relation to truth is echoed in the terms intuitively employed by Leclerc in typography, where stèle is the breach of the erection of all truths. À l'être comme stèle répond la pensée comme stabilisation, jusqu'à y compris dans le renversement du platonisme et dans la mutation de l'onto-idéologie en ontotypologie. And mimesis, on the other hand, la mimésie c'est le déclin de l'aletheia, le se coucher ou le s'allonger de la stèle. Mimésis c'est le mari couche-toi-là de la vérité. Truth and imitation regain their traditional values when we examine the question of ontotypology through the lens of gender. Mallarmé's apparent failure to avoid ontotypology and disrupt notions of gender, as effectively as he did those of syntax and representation more generally, do not prevent gender from interfering with and disorienting his thought, and these are precisely the stakes that I hope to pursue further in my research. Thank you.
panel is by Michael Rosenfeld, who is in the second year of his PhD at the University of Strasbourg and the Catholic University of Louvain. And Michael's PhD is entitled L'homosexualité sous le regard des naturalistes français et belges. And today, the title of Michael's paper is Sexual Orientation as a Measure of Openness Towards Others, about Georges Eekhoud. Is this how you pronounce it? Eekhoud.
It's a Flemish name. Good afternoon. On Wednesday, the 24th of October 1900, at 10:30 in the morning, at the Cour d'Assises in Bruges, a trial started, opening a window on an issue rarely spoken of at the time, sexual orientation. Georges Eekhoud, author of a novel called Escalvigor, which had been seized the summer before in a small coastal city of Hesse, is accused of having broken the laws on regulating the press, a euphemism for the dissemination of pornography. The trial is front news in Belgium at the time, as the cover of Le Peuple of Friday, the 26th of October 1900, demonstrates. Georges Eekhoud, aux Assises. It is, however, not only Eekhoud's novel which is on trial here, but also homosexuality, as explained by the prosecutor at the trial during his closing statement. Le ministère public résume son impression en qualifiant Escalvigor de livre infâme, d'œuvre de Sodome, de monument d'hypocrisie. Georges Eekhoud soutient, dit-il, qu'il a fait une œuvre sans conclusion et sans but. Mensonge. Il a voulu exalter, déifier un sentiment abominable. Il a dit lui-même, ici, lors de son interrogatoire par le président, qu'il voulait chanter cette passion. The circumstances surrounding this trial allowed for a very public debate to be held on the subject, circumventing the usual mechanisms which are in place to censure such exposure. Three elements make this trial unique. The first element is that Eekhoud, this is this list of publications, is a very well-known author by 1900. He has published 3 collections of poems, 5 collections of short stories, and 5 novels, and was awarded the most prestigious Belgian literary prize, le Prix quinquennal de la littérature française, for his 1894 novel La Nouvelle Carthage. He is a well-respected figure in avant-garde and literary circles, collaborating with various Belgian and French journals, including from 1894 onwards in the very popular Le Mercure de France, where he writes a monthly column called Chronique de Bruxelles. The second element concerns politics. The trial comes at the time of an ideological debate between the Conservative Catholic Party and the Liberal Reform Party in Belgium. Both sides use Eekhoud's trial to make a point. For the Catholics, Eekhoud's novel is a danger to morality and such literature must be stopped. For the liberals, freedom of expression and artistic freedom must be defended at all costs. Thirdly, Eekhoud has cloaked himself in bourgeois respectability. In 1887, he marries his former cook, Cornélie Van Camp, and they adopt 2 of his wife's orphaned nephews. His personal life, for as far as can be told, is therefore irreproachable. This allows him to distance himself from the contents of his literature. These 3 elements, and the fact that Eekhoud's defense team brilliantly managed to divert the attention of the jury from the subject at hand, homosexuality, to an ideological one, freedom of expression, allows for the relatively open debate which I will present here. Eekhoud's lawyers claim that an author has the absolute freedom to depict whatever he chooses in his literary work, without this having any bearing on his private life, and this allows all involved to discuss the novel and its contents during the trial without being labeled as defenders of homosexuality. The condemnation of homosexual acts is universal in this debate. The quote I read before from the prosecutor is emblematic of the public discourse at the time. Catholic newspapers like Le 20e siècle, in an article a few months before the trial on March the 10th, strongly condemned the book. En ce qui nous concerne, nous applaudissons hautement à l'initiative du parquet de Bruges, plus soucieux que d'autres de l'hygiène morale du pays, et nous souhaitons que son exemple soit suivi. L'impunité de l'ordure n'a que trop duré, et il est temps de réprimer ce que Léon Blois nomme la sédition de l'excrément. Even left-wing socialist newspapers do the same. Le Peuple, a socialist newspaper, mounts a scathing front-page attack on Escale Vigor a month after the trial, describing it as an apology for sodomy. Mais la pédérastie, l'onanisme, le sadisme, ce n'est pas l'amour, c'est la maladie, c'est la profanation de l'amour. The writer of this article, Auguste Duin, is known for a series of books he has written on pauperism and on the poor people of Flanders and how to change their lot. He accuses Eekhoud of daring to write positively of a subject which would not be discussed or mentioned though. Le Petit Bleu du Matin, a left-wing newspaper which supports Eekhoud throughout his whole period, probably because Eekhoud's longtime lover, Sandrière Perron, is a journalist in the same newspaper, makes Eekhoud's acquittal front-page news. You can see it there. Bruges, le verdict dans le procès Eekhoud, service spécial du Petit Bleu. Les plaidoiries terminées, voire l'audience sous la rubrique tribunaux, le jury rentre à 7h15 dans la salle de délibération. Il a à répondre à 3 questions. La première est relative à l'identité de l'auteur, la deuxième à la mise en vente, et la troisième à l'outrage aux mœurs. Après une demi-heure de délibération, le jury revient avec un verdict négatif. Monsieur Eekhoud est donc acquitté. L'auditoire applaudit vigoureusement. In other newspapers, nobody applauds. However, even Le Petit Bleu has a very different tone when the subject is homosexuality during the trial. À la reprise de l'audience, Monsieur le procureur du roi discute scientifiquement l'uranisme. La nausée reprend. Passons. The author of these articles, covering the trial proceedings in Le Petit Bleu du Matin, is Eekhoud's friend Georges Eekhoud, a lawyer who is thus able to attend the sessions of the trial, which are held behind closed doors. His personal remark, inserted in the midst of technical proceedings and who says what, only goes to show that even Eekhoud's supporters refuse to condone homosexuality. It is this concealment which allows so many of Eekhoud's francophone literary colleagues to support him, signing the following petition which was presented to the court. The signatories include Émile Zola, Maurice Barrès, Rachid, Pierre-Louis, Anatole France, Paul Valéry, Gustave Kahn, Stuart Merrill, Léon Blum, Octave Mirbeau, Paul Adam, Bernard Lazare, Lucien Ricard, Henri Gauthier-Villard, Henri Desdavray, André Gide, José Maria de Heredia, Alfred Géry, and this goes on for pages and pages. The who's who of literary friends signed this petition to defend Eekhoud. Now, Escale Vigor had been published in 1898 in installments in the very popular Mercure de France, meaning that these supporters of Eekhoud must have been aware of the contents of the novel and of the provocative statements it encompasses. This is not the first of Eekhoud's works to contain such explosive content. Eekhoud often inserts parts of his personal diary in his novels, describing handsome young men, and thereby emphasizing the sexual orientation which is apparent throughout all of his work, often brazenly so. Many of Eekhoud's characters are bisexual. They sleep with men, with women, according to their current taste. One example of homosexuality in Eekhoud's literature is the short story Le Tribunal au Chauffoir from 1896, which is, as you can see, dedicated to Oscar Wilde. À Monsieur Oscar Wilde, au poète et au martyr païen, torturé au nom de la justice et de la vertu protestante. In the story itself, a young aristocrat defends his arrest for homosexuality. Oh, moi, je suis l'amoureux maudit, né sous le signe d'Uranie. Crime contre nature, dirait-il? Contre quelle nature? Ma vie entière n'avait-elle pas été un crime contre ma nature à moi? Escale Vigor, the novel which is on trial, contains more subtle messages of love between the young Count Henri de Kelmarck and his secretary Guidon. Kelmarck, who returns to the ancestral castle of Escale Vigor on the fictional island of Smaragdis in the kingdom of Kerlingrand, meets the adolescent Guidon on the island and their love flourishes. Oh, mon doux enfant, gémit-il, en tombant au pied du petit parc, je t'aime éperdument, je t'aime autant que Gérard aimait Tiennet. Moi je vous aime aussi, cher maître, et cela de toutes mes forces, répondit Guidon, en lui jetant les bras au cou. Je suis à vous seul et sans partage, et c'est seulement d'à présent que vous le savez, faites de moi tout ce que vous voudrez. Henri and Guidon decide to leave the island, however, just before they need to participate in a traditional religious festival, which is to become their demise, as Guidon is brutally assaulted by the women of the island, who undress and rape him until he is but torn flesh and blood. Done with him, the mob decide to throw him in the sea. Henri hears his cries and tries to save him. Ultimately, their housekeeper is the one to drag both men back to the castle. This is the scene that you see depicted here. She bares her breasts to calm the populace. This is the illustration from the 1930 edition, American edition of the book, published under the title A Strange Love, the story of an abnormal passion. As Guidon lies dying, the final scene emerges, et ses lèvres, ayant repris les lèvres de l'enfant, éperdument offertes au ciel, Guidon et Henri confondirent leurs haleines dans un suprême baiser. As Henri dies together with his beloved, the housekeeper closes their eyes and prays. This love seems very straightforward to us. Two men love each other, they consummate this love and get killed for it. However, such a narrative would have brought Eekhoud a conviction for pornography, and this explains why Eekhoud makes a great leap of faith. He insists that his presentation of the subject is chaste, and that the love he presents is homogenic love, following Edward Carpenter's theory of male-virile friendship, which has no sexual undertones. The characters he describes are inverts and not perverts. Although they are sick, they should not be punished with pities. Eekhoud explains this in an article in Le Peuple on December 2nd, 1900, in a reaction to the attack which I spoke about just before. This is the article. Dans mon livre, il n'y a aucune scène répréhensible, aucun récit sadique, il n'y a rien de l'onanisme. J'ai décrit un cas pathologique, une anomalie sexuelle. Chez l'inverti, au contraire, on peut rencontrer toutes les noblesses de l'amour sans qu'il descende jusqu'aux pratiques immondes dont il n'est pas question dans mon livre. Notre interlocuteur disparaît un moment, mais bientôt il revient porteur d'un bouquin. C'est le livre du docteur Moll de Berlin sur la perversion de l'instinct génital. Ce fait scientifique doit faire justice aux préjugés traditionnels en vertu duquel des malheureux, dotés par un sort cruel de sensations et d'instincts homosexuels et privés des joies de la vie de famille, étaient considérés comme des êtres immoraux, uniquement dignes de mépris. Tout ami de la vérité et de l'humanité apprendra avec satisfaction que le perverti sexuel est un malheureux et non un criminel. As you can read, Eekhoud reinforces his argument with scientific proof, standing up during the interview to bring a book from his library showing that his theories are based on science. Now let me assure you that this is but a tactic of Eekhoud's, in order to avoid a large fine and maybe even jail time if he is convicted. In his private life, as his biography shows, Eekhoud is very much a practicing homosexual. In 1892, he meets Sander Pierron, then a 19, this is in the early 20th century. At the time, Sander Pierron was considered to be a very beautiful 19-year-old young lithographer, and their correspondence leaves no doubt as to the nature of their relationship. I'm just going to quote one short passage of a letter that Eekhoud sent Sander Pierron just a few months before the trial. 22nd of August 1900, soir. À samedi donc, mon bien-aimé petit Sander. Je serais bien plus heureux de t'embrasser autrement que par ces lignes où je mets cependant toute l'ardeur de mon fluide télépathique. I love you and will be happy in your love, my sweetest boy, thy Georges. Eekhoud often uses English in his letters to Sander Pierron and also in his private diary when he speaks about his sexuality, for the very simple reason that his wife didn't speak any English, and in order to avoid conflict with her. The following two passages of his private diary only emphasize the very physical aspect of Eekhoud's sexuality. This time, he describes meeting a young man in the streets of Brussels. 27th of March 1902, I had him yesterday. It was long since I had got him in his velvet breeches. We had a splendid 69. 23rd of June 1902, Friday night I had my velvation. He had on his velvet breeches. We had a splendid 69 and enjoyed each other simultaneously. As you can see, Eekhoud has a fascination with velvet breeches, and he publishes a novel called Les Voyous de Velours in 1904, in which all of the young men in Brussels with whom the narrator has relations all wear velvet breeches. It is of course possible that none of Eekhoud's friends knew anything of this life he lived and assumed him to be a happily married heterosexual man. I find that hard to believe though, and I'm therefore very glad also to be able to present with evidence to the contrary in a recently discovered letter which I am presenting here for the first, not only here, to the world for the first time. Théodore Hannon, a poet and an illustrator who is a friend of Eekhoud's, and whose main claim to fame is being mentioned in Yoriska Huysmans' 1884 novel À rebours. Théodore Hannon is Des Esseintes, the main character's favorite poet. That's his main claim to fame. He is completely forgotten these days. His poetry is completely forgotten, and after his 2 volumes of poetry, he became an illustrator and he completely stopped creating literary works. Hannon and Eekhoud have known each other for decades from the various magazines and publications where they work together. They are close friends, and this sentiment is expressed in Hannon's poem Les Vierges Byzantines from 1884 also, and you can see that it's dedicated to Georges Eekhoud. No, this doesn't work. So. Eekhoud's personal copy of Rime de Joie, which you can see here, contains a handwritten dedication from Théodore Hannon à Georges Eekhoud en toute sympathie, and 2 surprises. Firstly, the handwritten original manuscript of Vierges Byzantines. The presence of the manuscript of the poem in this book is very interesting. It reinforces the feeling one has about the ambiguous sexuality of the subject of the poem. At a certain point, one wonders if the Byzantine virgin is a virgin because the narrator is not interested in her wives. The second surprise is the letter Hannon sent Eekhoud on the first day of the trial, which is also bound into the book. The importance of this letter requires that I quote it in full. Please note the drawing of the little pig, which, by the way, has a magistrate's hat on its head. I will read the letter in French, but I also put a small translation in English so for those who have difficulty. Ami Georges, bravo pour ton entrée triomphale au tribunal brugeois, bravissimo pour ta non moins triomphale et certaine sortie. Entre les deux, tu pourras réciter à ces cochons, and that's where the pigs come into the pig come into the picture. Le ci-dessous quatrain rimait entre 2 hommes, ou mieux, dans des hommes. Si vraiment j'étais des sodomes, vous en paraissez convaincus, je devrais vous aimer, sot d'homme, car vous n'êtes qu'un tas de cul. Avec mes 2 mains dans les 2 tiennes, ça fait 4 pattes, ton vieux, signed Théodore Hannon. The surprising sexual innuendos of this letter and the humor with which Hannon treats the whole issue of Eekhoud's homosexuality are basically at the base of my argument in this presentation. Even though it can be argued that this is a private letter not destined for dissemination, it should be noted that Hannon was prepared to testify in Eekhoud's favor at the trial. He told the other witnesses that he even prepared a number of humorous statements in order to ridicule the prosecution. However, to Hannon's great frustration, he is not called up as a witness due to lack of time. We can only assume that the opinions articulated in the letter would also have been expressed during the trial. In all fairness to Eekhoud, it is biased to blame him for hiding behind the concept of homogenic love in order to avoid censure during and directly after the trial. Barely a month and a half after his acquittal, he writes a very courageous article in L'Effort Éclectique, a Belgian anarchist journal, in which he not only defends his novel, Escale Vigor combat le préjugé qui a la vie plus dure que la vue juridique. J'ai montré à nu l'âme d'un inverti, j'ai suivi les péripéties du terrible drame moral qui se joue en lui depuis la naissance, but where he also lends his support for the abolition of paragraph 175 of the German Penal Code criminalizing sodomy, using the French precedent as a justification in defending the rights of homosexuals to love as they please. Vous me demandez si, à mon avis, l'inversion sexuelle est de nature à entamer la valeur morale de celui qui en est affligé. J'affirme catégoriquement et en toute conscience que non. Amour contre nature, nombreux cas d'homosexualité chez les animaux. Homosexualité chronique et permanente dans beaucoup d'espèces. The legacy of Eekhoud's trial cannot be denied. It made him a hero of some sorts, his novel reaching a 6th edition by 1901. Ironically, the trial was a great publicity event. Eekhoud also becomes the focal point for homosexual intellectuals throughout Europe. Edward Carpenter in England, Magnus Hirschfeld and Wilhelm Eugen in Germany, Jacob Israel de Haan in the Netherlands, André Gide and Jean Lorrain in France. All are in contact with Eekhoud after the trial. Eekhoud's public activity and gay militancy greatly increased in the years after the trial. In addition, the debate surrounding the issue only emphasized the way in which such debates with the contemporary constraints that surround homosexuality can and should be held. The various narratives of the debate, ranging from the vocal censure of the majority to the supportive voices of the minority and the brave defense of those involved, allow me to summarize that when circumstances force someone to hide his true identity, as Eekhoud had to do, any solution found to still express one's opinion is legitimate. Let's conclude with Eekhoud's daring statement in defending free love in La Revue Blanche, an extremely prestigious and widely read artistic magazine published in Paris. This is the March 1902 edition. Loin de condamner les joies charnelles, je souhaite qu'on rende à la chair, à la beauté physique, le culte que lui rendaient les Grecs et les Renaissants. Je suis partisan de l'amour libre et je légitime toutes les voluptés qui ne portent pas atteinte à la liberté d'autrui ou qui n'impliquent pas un abus d'autorité, une tyrannie, une contrainte, une violence, un arbitraire physique ou moral.